The concrete dust still hung in the air over Jenin refugee camp when the Israeli Defense Forces began counting their losses. April 9, 2002. 13 soldiers gone in a single ambush. The deadliest day for the IDF since the Lebanon War 20 years earlier. Inside a narrow alley that would become known simply as the bathtub, reserve soldiers had walked straight into a trap that changed everything about how modern militaries think about clearing buildings. The mission had seemed straightforward enough. Palestinian militants had turned the densely packed refugee camp into a fortress, with booby traps on nearly every door and fighters waiting in ambush positions throughout the labyrinth of alleyways. Israeli commanders sent in their troops using tactics that had become standard across Western militaries. Move fast, dominate the space, get inside the room before the enemy can react. Speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence of action. But in Jenin, speed got soldiers terminated. The militants had studied Israeli tactics from previous operations. They knew exactly what to expect. When that column of reserve soldiers pushed into the narrow alley, moving quickly to clear the buildings, explosives detonated beneath them. Fighters opened fire from multiple positions. In the chaos that followed, 13 men lost their lives, and the Israeli military was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The tactics they had been using, the same tactics taught by American Special Operations Forces around the world, were getting people hurt unnecessarily. Before we go further into this story, I want to ask you to do something. If you're finding this content valuable, hit that like button right now. It helps more people discover these lessons that were literally written in the experiences of soldiers on the battlefield. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this series on military tactics that changed modern warfare. Your support keeps this content coming. Now, let's continue. The aftermath of Jenin forced Israeli military leadership to completely rethink their approach to urban combat. General Dan Harrell, head of IDF operations, admitted there were indications it was going to be hard, but they didn't think it would be so difficult. An internal investigation followed 6 months later. While it placed some responsibility on tactical decisions made in the moment, the deeper questions remained. How do you clear a building when the enemy knows you're coming? How do you neutralize threats without exposing your people to unacceptable risk? The answer would come from a small, specialized unit that most people had never heard of. LOTAR, officially designated as Unit 707, serves as the Israeli Special Forces Authority on everything related to counter-terror warfare. But LOTAR's origins stretch back even further than Jenin, to a period in Israeli history when the nature of the threat changed dramatically. In the early 1970s, Palestinian militant groups began launching terror attacks that required a different kind of military response. The Munich Olympics attack in 1972, the Mayalot massacre in 1974, airplane hijackings, hostage situations. Traditional military tactics designed for conventional warfare simply didn't work against terrorists operating in civilian spaces. Israel needed a new approach, a new doctrine, and a new kind of unit to develop and refine it. LOTAR was born from this necessity. The unit's mandate was twofold. First, develop and certify all counter-terror operators within the Israeli Special Forces community in specialized skills: hand-to-hand combat, underground warfare, close-quarters combat, sniping, tactical rappelling, and more. Second, maintain an operational counter-terror unit that could respond to active situations throughout Israel and conduct high-risk arrests, searches, and raids in hostile territory. But what set LOTAR apart was not just their operational capability. It was their approach to developing tactics, techniques, and protocols. Every LOTAR instructor conducted regular field operations, putting their teaching methods to the test in real combat situations throughout the West Bank and Gaza. When something didn't work, when tactics led to casualties or mission failure, LOTAR went back to the drawing board. They refined, they adapted, And gradually they developed an approach to clearing buildings that looked completely wrong to anyone trained in Western military doctrine. To understand why Israeli tactics seem so counterintuitive, you need to understand what American and other Western militaries teach about room clearing. The doctrine is called dynamic entry, and it's built on three core principles: speed, surprise, and violence of action. Here's how it works. A team of operators stacks up outside a room. They breach the door, typically with explosive charges or mechanical methods. If the situation warrants it, they throw in a flashbang grenade, a noise flash diversionary device that temporarily stuns anyone inside. Then, immediately after the bang, they flood into the room with overwhelming force. The first operator through the door moves quickly to his corner, weapon up, and takes what's called a point of domination. The second operator is right on his heels, moving to the opposite corner. The goal is to get bodies into the room faster than the enemy can process what's happening. The theory relies on something called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. If you can get through that loop faster than your opponent, if you can be shooting before they've finished processing the fact that you're in the room, you win. It sounds good. It makes for dramatic training videos and Hollywood movies, and under certain specific conditions, it works. But there's a problem, a fundamental vulnerability that insurgents and terrorists around the world have learned to exploit. That vulnerability is the doorway itself. In dynamic entry, there's a moment, usually lasting only a second or two, when operators are completely exposed as they cross the threshold. They're silhouetted against the light from behind them. They're moving through a narrow space where they can't take cover. And if there's a threat in the center of the room, the number one man has been trained to ignore it and move to his corner, trusting that the number 3 or 4 man in the stack will neutralize that center threat. This is where people get hurt. In Jenin, militants exploited exactly this vulnerability. They positioned themselves to catch Israeli soldiers in the doorway or immediately after entry, when the soldiers were committed to movement and couldn't quickly respond to threats from unexpected angles. The Israeli approach that emerged after Jenin looked completely different. Instead of dynamic entry focused on speed and domination, Lothar developed what's called limited penetration with threshold assessment. And to American eyes, it looked absolutely wrong. Here's the fundamental difference. Instead of rushing into the room, Israeli tactics emphasize clearing as much of the space as possible before anyone crosses the threshold. This involves a technique called slicing the pie, or panning the doorway. An operator positions himself at an angle to the door and slowly increases his view into the room, degree by degree, clearing visual slices of the interior space, while maintaining the ability to use the wall as cover. American instructors watching this technique often object immediately. You're too slow, they say. You're giving up the element of surprise. You're exposing yourself to incoming fire from the doorway. The Israelis have a simple response. We're minimizing the exposure of our people to unknown threats, and we're engaging threats before we commit to entering a space where we might be trapped. The Israeli method involves extensive use of what they call threshold dominance. Before entry, operators will use every available tool to reduce the threat inside the room. This might include calling out verbal commands, demanding that occupants move to a safe area. It might involve using mirrors or cameras to see around corners and through doorways. In high-threat situations, it might mean softening the target with grenades or automatic weapons fire through windows and doors before anyone enters. To dynamic entry advocates, this sounds excessive, even reckless. But the Israeli perspective is different. They're operating in an environment where nearly every building might be booby-trapped, where militants have prepared ambush positions, where the cost of walking into a trap is measured in lives lost. In that context, taking the extra time to clear from the threshold to eliminate threats before exposure makes perfect sense. The statistics tell the story. When Israeli forces changed their tactics after Jenin, when they began emphasizing threshold assessment and limited penetration over dynamic entry, when they started using armored bulldozers to breach walls instead of sending soldiers through doors, casualty rates dropped dramatically. Operations that might have cost dozens of lives were completed with minimal losses. The exact figure varies depending on the specific operation and circumstances, but the overall trend was unmistakable. Slower, more deliberate tactics kept soldiers alive. This brings us to the question in the title, how did Israeli commandos teach Americans to clear rooms wrong and cut casualties by such a dramatic margin? The answer lies not just in the specific techniques, but in a fundamental philosophical shift about what success means in close quarters battle. American military culture, particularly in special operations, places enormous value on speed and aggression. The idea of taking more time, of being more cautious, of slowing down, feels like weakness. It contradicts everything taught in decades of training and operations. When LOTAR instructors first began working with U.S. Marines and other American forces, the initial reaction was skepticism. The training exchanges began in earnest in the 2010s. U.S. Marines with the Black Sea Rotational Force traveled to Israeli military bases to train with IDF counter-terror instructors. Other units followed. Marine Corps' Air Station Iwakuni sent Marines to learn Israeli tactics for active shooter scenarios. The training lasted anywhere from a few days to a week or more. What the Americans discovered was that Israeli tactics weren't just different. They were based on a completely different risk calculus. American doctrine accepts a certain level of risk to the entry team in exchange for speed. The thinking is that if you move fast enough, you'll minimize your overall exposure to danger. Israeli doctrine rejects this trade-off. It says that speed doesn't minimize risk. If you're moving into an unknown situation, it just means you're running blindly into potential ambushes. The Israeli instructors taught techniques that seemed to violate everything Americans knew about room clearing. Instead of stacking tight on the door, they maintained distance. Instead of flooding into rooms immediately after breaching, they cleared from the threshold. Instead of prioritizing speed, they emphasized methodical threat elimination. One Marine veteran who analyzed Israeli combat footage noted something interesting. In situations where IDF soldiers moved quickly and casually through spaces, treating buildings as if they were already cleared, that's when they got into trouble. The most effective operations were the ones where Israeli forces took their time, used technology like drones to clear areas before sending in ground forces, and maintained strict discipline about not exposing soldiers to unnecessary danger. This is a good moment to remind you that if you haven't already, leave a comment below. What do you think about these different approaches? Have you trained in these tactics? Your comments help build a community where we can learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. The Israeli approach extends beyond just the mechanics of how you enter a room. It's about the entire structure of an operation. In Operation House and Garden, conducted in Jenin in 2024, Israeli forces demonstrated the full evolution of their urban warfare doctrine. They established an operational headquarters. They used drones and unmanned aerial vehicles not primarily for striking targets, as in other theaters, but specifically for clearing hostile elements from urban warfare zones and assisting ground forces in advancing through densely populated areas. These drones provided real-time intelligence to ground forces. They helped distinguish between armed militants and civilians. They allowed Israeli commanders to identify trapped roads that had been rigged with explosives, and destroy approximately 2 to 3 kilometers of explosive-laden pathways out of 13 kilometers of roads in the refugee camp. This kind of precision, based on detailed intelligence and deliberate action, minimized infrastructure damage and prevented broader destruction. The results speak for themselves. Despite engaging in combat within a densely populated and complex urban environment, Israeli forces concluded Operation House and Garden without causing any civilian fatalities among innocent residents. This outcome reflected Israel's commitment to minimizing harm to non-combatants. The operation demonstrated that slower, more deliberate tactics don't just save your own soldiers' lives, they also reduce collateral damage. Compare this to traditional dynamic entry operations, where the emphasis on speed and violence of action often leads to higher civilian casualties. When you're flooding a room with operators firing on the move, when you're using grenades and automatic weapons to clear every space, the risk of harming non-combatants increases dramatically. The Israeli limited penetration approach, with its emphasis on assessment before entry, allows for better discrimination between threats and innocents. There's another element to Israeli tactics that Americans initially found counterintuitive: the use of heavy equipment in close-quarters environments. After the ambush in Jenin, Israeli forces began using armored bulldozers to breach walls instead of sending soldiers through doors. They would ram the corner of a house, opening a hole, and then an armored personnel carrier would arrive to disembark troops directly into the house. This method, developed under fire during the Battle of Jenin, exposed soldiers to far less risk than traditional breach and clear operations. American doctrine typically views this kind of heavy equipment use as excessive, even counterproductive. It's loud. It gives away your position. It destroys property. But from the Israeli perspective, all of those concerns are secondary to keeping soldiers alive. Yes, the bulldozer is loud, but in an urban environment where the enemy already knows you're coming, where they've had time to prepare positions and booby-trap buildings, stealth is an illusion anyway. Better to use the tools that minimize exposure. This philosophical difference gets to the heart of why Israeli tactics seemed wrong to American observers. They were optimized for a different scenario. American Special Operations doctrine is largely built around hostage rescue and high-value target raids. In these situations, speed genuinely matters. You need to get to the hostage before the captors can harm them. You need to catch the target before they can escape or activate a dead man's switch. Dynamic entry makes sense in this context, but Israeli forces operate primarily in a different environment. They're conducting arrest operations in hostile territory. They're clearing buildings in areas where the entire neighborhood might be hostile. They're operating under the assumption that stealth and surprise are already compromised. In this context, the premium shifts from speed to survivability. The training methodology also differs significantly. American close-quarters battle training often emphasizes what's called battle drills, standardized responses to specific situations that are drilled until they become automatic. Battle Drill 6, the standard U.S. Army room clearing drill, is taught the same way across the force. The advantage is consistency and muscle memory. The disadvantage is that it can become ritualistic, with operators executing the drill even when the specific situation calls for something different. Israeli training, particularly within Lotar, emphasizes what they call behavior-based tactics. Instead of learning a single standardized drill, operators learn principles and decision-making frameworks. They're taught to assess each threshold, each doorway, each tactical problem individually and choose the appropriate technique. This might be a dynamic entry in one situation, a deliberate threshold assessment in another, or a tactical call-out where you don't enter at all. This behavior-based approach requires more training time and more tactical maturity from operators. You can't just teach someone a drill and send them out. They need to understand the underlying principles well enough to make sound decisions under pressure, but the payoff is operators who can adapt to novel situations instead of rigidly following a playbook that might not fit the circumstances. When American units started incorporating Israeli techniques, the results were striking. Marines who trained with Lotar instructors reported that the Israeli shooting style and tactical methods were different from what they'd learned, but the underlying concept remained the same: neutralizing threats while minimizing risk to friendly forces. More importantly, When these Marines applied Israeli threshold assessment techniques in training scenarios, they found themselves taking less simulated casualties. The shift wasn't immediate or universal. Military institutions are inherently conservative, especially when it comes to tactics that have been proven in combat. Dynamic entry had worked for American forces in countless operations. Why change what works? But as more units experimented with Israeli methods, as more instructors observed the results, the evidence became harder to ignore. Slower, more deliberate tactics were keeping people alive. There is an interesting paradox at the heart of this tactical evolution. The Israeli methods that seem wrong to American eyes are actually closer to what Western militaries taught before the rise of modern special operations. If you look at World War II-era urban combat doctrine, it emphasized heavy use of explosives, suppressive fire, and methodical clearing. Soldiers would shoot doors open, toss grenades into rooms, and only then enter with guns blazing. The shift toward speed-oriented dynamic entry came later, driven largely by the needs of counterterrorism and hostage rescue units. These specialized missions required different tactics. But over time, these specialized tactics became the default for all close-quarters situations, even ones where speed wasn't actually advantageous. What Israeli forces did, in essence, was recognize that not every situation is a hostage rescue, and adjust tactics accordingly. The modern synthesis that's emerging in American tactical training represents a hybrid approach. It recognizes that different situations call for different methods. If you have surprise, if time is critical, if you know where the threats are, dynamic entry might be the right choice. But if the enemy knows you're coming, if the building might be booby-trapped, if you have time to be methodical, Israeli-style limited penetration and threshold assessment might save lives. This hybrid approach is sometimes called Immediate Threat Close Quarters Battle, or ITCQB. It was developed by former Israeli Special Operations members working with American tactical instructors, and it explicitly combines elements from both doctrines. The ITCQB methodology gives operators a framework for making tactical decisions based on the specific threat level, the environment, and the mission requirements. The adoption of these hybrid methods has been particularly notable in law enforcement. Police tactical teams face many of the same challenges as Israeli military units. They're operating in environments where suspects often know the police are coming. They're entering buildings where family members or hostages might be present, requiring careful discrimination between threats and non-combatants. The speed-at-all-costs approach that might work for military special operations can be disastrous in these scenarios. Law enforcement tactical trainers began teaching what they call deliberate entry alongside dynamic entry. Deliberate entry incorporates many Israeli techniques: slicing the pie, threshold assessment, the use of mirrors and cameras, verbal call-outs, and ballistic shields. The emphasis is on gathering information and controlling the situation before committing to entry. Departments that adopted these methods reported fewer officer casualties and fewer situations where officers mistakenly engaged non-threats. There is another layer to this story that's worth exploring. The Israeli emphasis on minimizing friendly casualties doesn't come from an abstract philosophical commitment. It comes from cold demographic reality. Israel is a small country with a small population. Every soldier's life represents not just a human tragedy, but a significant loss of national capability. The IDF simply cannot afford the casualty rates that larger militaries might accept as the cost of doing business. This creates different incentives for tactical development. When casualties are unacceptable, when every loss generates enormous public scrutiny and political pressure, military forces are forced to innovate. They can't just accept that room clearing is inherently dangerous and casualties are inevitable. They have to find ways to reduce risk, even if those ways seem overly cautious or slow to observers from larger militaries. The data from Israeli operations in Gaza illustrates this point. During ground operations between October 27, 2023, and early January 2024, the IDF lost approximately 175 soldiers, a rate of roughly 2.65 soldiers per day. These figures, while tragic, were actually lower than some military analysts expected for urban combat operations of that intensity. The reason? Israeli forces used extensive precautions, methodical clearing procedures, and heavy use of supporting assets like drones and armored vehicles to minimize exposure. Critics sometimes portray these Israeli tactics as excessively destructive, pointing to the use of bulldozers and heavy weapons in urban areas. But from a tactical perspective, this criticism misses the point. Israeli forces are making a deliberate choice to accept property damage in exchange for protecting their soldiers. They're choosing to breach through walls with bulldozers rather than send soldiers through doors where they might be ambushed. They're choosing to use drones and precision fires to clear buildings rather than risk soldiers in close quarters engagements. This gets us to a fundamental question about military ethics and the laws of war. Which is more ethical, accepting higher friendly casualties to minimize property damage, or using more destructive methods to keep your own people alive while still attempting to minimize harm to non-combatants? There's no easy answer, and different militaries reach different conclusions based on their own values and constraints. What's clear is that Israeli tactical innovations weren't developed in a vacuum. They emerged from specific operational experiences, specific failures, specific tragedies like the ambush in Jenin. Every tactical doctrine is written in blood, as the saying goes. The question is whether you learn from that blood and adapt, or whether you keep doing things the same way because that's how they've always been done. The spread of Israeli tactics to American forces represents a recognition that there's value in learning from allies who operate in different contexts and face different challenges. The U.S. military's historical strength has been its ability to study what works wherever it's found and adapt those lessons. When the Marines sent units to train with LOTAR, when law enforcement agencies began incorporating Israeli threshold assessment techniques, they were continuing that tradition of tactical evolution. But adoption hasn't been uniform or uncritical. Some American tactical instructors remain skeptical of Israeli methods. They argue that the Israeli approach trades speed for safety and that in many situations that trade-off is unacceptable. They point to successful hostage rescues and high-value target raids where dynamic entry clearly worked. They're not wrong. The key insight is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to close-quarters battle. The future of CQB training appears to be moving toward this kind of tactical flexibility. Instead of teaching one doctrine as the gospel truth, advanced programs teach multiple methodologies and train operators to recognize which approach fits the specific situation. This requires more training time and higher levels of tactical sophistication, but it produces operators who are truly adaptable rather than just well-drilled in a single technique. Technology is also changing the equation. The use of drones for pre-assault reconnaissance, the development of better cameras and sensors that can see through walls or around corners, advances in less lethal weapons and robots that can enter buildings before humans. All of these technologies tend to favor Israeli-style methodical approaches over American-style dynamic entry. If you can see what's in the room before you enter, if you can send a robot through the door first, the premium on speed decreases and the value of careful assessment increases. There is also a growing recognition that the tactical environment is changing. The kinds of enemies that Western militaries face today are not the same as those they faced 20 or 30 years ago. Modern insurgents and terrorists have studied Western tactics extensively. They've watched the training videos. They've learned what to expect. In places like Jenin, like the urban battlefields of Iraq and Syria, enemies specifically prepare ambushes designed to exploit the predictable patterns of Western room-clearing doctrine. Against this kind of adaptive enemy, tactical flexibility becomes a survival skill. If your opponents know exactly how you're going to clear a building because you always do it the same way, they can prepare accordingly. But if you have multiple options, if you can choose dynamic entry or deliberate entry or threshold assessment, or even tactical call-out depending on the situation, you become much harder to predict and counter. The psychological aspects of this tactical evolution are worth considering as well. Dynamic entry is inherently stressful. You're training your body and mind to do something that every instinct screams is dangerous. Run into a confined space where people might be trying to end your life. The only way to make that tolerable is through intensive training that turns the dangerous action into an automatic response. You train until thinking stops and muscle memory takes over. Israeli threshold assessment techniques work differently. Instead of overriding your survival instincts through training, they work with those instincts. Your brain's natural caution about moving into unknown spaces, its desire to gather information before taking action. These become tactical advantages rather than obstacles to overcome. Operators report that Israeli methods feel more natural, less stressful, precisely because they don't require you to suppress your instinctive threat assessment. This has implications for training and retention. The burnout rate in special operations units is extremely high, driven partly by the constant psychological stress of training for and conducting high-risk operations. If you can accomplish missions effectively while inducing less psychological stress on operators, you might be able to sustain operational effectiveness over longer careers. This is speculative, but it's an area where Israeli approaches might offer advantages beyond just tactical outcomes. We should also address what Israeli tactics don't do. They don't eliminate risk. Urban combat remains one of the most dangerous missions any military can undertake. Buildings are inherently advantageous for defenders. The attacker has to move through spaces the defender has prepared, crossing fatal funnels, making themselves vulnerable. No amount of tactical sophistication changes this fundamental asymmetry. What Israeli tactics do is shift the risk calculus. Instead of accepting exposure during entry, they accept longer mission timelines. Instead of relying on speed and surprise, they rely on patience and overwhelming support. It's a different set of trade-offs, not a magic solution. And in some situations, those trade-offs aren't acceptable. If time is genuinely critical, if surprise is genuinely achievable, dynamic entry might still be the right choice. The 80% casualty reduction mentioned in the title represents what's possible when tactics are matched to the specific operational environment. When Israeli forces changed their approach after Jenin, when they stopped trying to win through speed and started winning through methodical dominance, casualty rates dropped dramatically. The exact percentage varies depending on which specific operations and timeframes you compare, but the overall trend is undeniable. Deliberate tactics keep people alive in situations where the enemy knows you're coming and has prepared accordingly. American units that have adopted Israeli-influenced tactics report similar results in training scenarios. When Marines clear buildings using threshold assessment instead of immediate dynamic entry, they take fewer simulated casualties from role players representing threats. When law enforcement teams use deliberate entry with verbal call-outs and visual reconnaissance, they have fewer situations where officers are ambushed or mistakenly engage non-threats. These aren't just academic improvements. Every simulated casualty in training represents a real person who might have lived if different tactics had been used. Every time an officer or soldier makes it through a high-risk building entry without getting hurt, that's a person who goes home to their family. The stakes couldn't be higher. As we near the end of this discussion, it's worth reflecting on what this story tells us about military innovation more broadly. The Israeli tactical revolution didn't come from some theoretical insight or academic study. It came from operational failure, from soldiers lost in ambushes, from leaders who looked at the casualty reports and said, there has to be a better way. The American adoption of Israeli techniques didn't come from doctrinal mandates or top-down reform. It came from individual units training with Israeli instructors, seeing results, and gradually spreading those lessons through the force. This is how tactical innovation actually happens, through painful experience, careful observation, and a willingness to question established doctrine when it's not working. The tension between Israeli and American approaches to room clearing reflects deeper questions about military culture, risk tolerance, and what success means. Is a mission successful if you accomplished the objective, but lost people doing it? Is speed always valuable, or does it sometimes just mean failing faster? These aren't questions with simple answers, and different military cultures reach different conclusions based on their histories, their constraints, and their values. What's encouraging is that these different approaches are increasingly seen as complementary rather than contradictory. American tactical training is becoming more sophisticated, teaching multiple methodologies instead of a single doctrine. Israeli forces, meanwhile, have learned from American experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, incorporating some elements of dynamic tactics where appropriate. The result is a richer tactical toolkit for everyone involved. Before we finish, I want to thank you for watching this deep dive into how Israeli tactics revolutionized room clearing. If you found this valuable, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and turned on notifications. We have more episodes coming that explore other tactical innovations that changed modern warfare. Check out the other videos on the channel as well. And please leave a comment with your thoughts and experiences. This community learns together. The story of how Israeli commandos taught Americans to clear rooms wrong is really a story about questioning assumptions. For decades, Western militaries assumed that speed was always advantageous in close-quarters battle. Israeli operational experience in places like Jenin challenged that assumption and demonstrated that in many situations, methodical deliberation beats reckless speed. The casualty reduction that came from adopting these tactics wasn't magic. It was the result of matching methodology to the operational environment. When you're operating in an area where surprise is impossible, where enemies have prepared positions, where every doorway might be fatal, charging through that doorway isn't brave, it's foolish. Taking the time to assess, to gather information, to eliminate threats before exposing yourself, that's what keeps people alive. As military technology continues to evolve, as drones and robots and sensors give us more ways to see and understand spaces before we enter them, the advantages of deliberate tactics will likely increase. The Israeli approach of using every available tool to reduce risk before committing personnel will become easier and more effective. Meanwhile, the situations where pure speed provides a decisive advantage will become rarer. This doesn't mean dynamic entry will disappear. There will always be scenarios where time is critical and calculated aggression is the right answer. But the future of close-quarters battle is probably hybrid, flexible, adaptive. Operators trained in multiple methodologies, capable of choosing the right approach for the specific situation, supported by technology that reduces risk and enhances situational awareness. The lessons from Jenin, from LOTAR training, from Israeli operations across decades of urban warfare are now part of the global tactical conversation. American Marines training in Israel, European law enforcement learning threshold assessment, tactical instructors around the world incorporating limited penetration techniques into their programs. The knowledge that was written in blood in the alleys of Jenin is now saving lives around the world. That's perhaps the most important takeaway from this entire story. Military tactics aren't about ego or tradition or doing things the way they've always been done. They're about keeping people alive while accomplishing the mission. When Israeli instructors showed American forces a different way to clear rooms, a way that seemed wrong but got results, The smart response was to learn to adapt, to take what works and make it your own. The room-clearing revolution is still ongoing. New technologies, new threats, new operational environments will continue to drive tactical evolution. But the fundamental lesson that Israeli forces learned in Jenin and taught to their American counterparts remains constant. Speed without information is recklessness, and sometimes the fastest way to accomplish a mission is to slow down enough to do it right